All right.
Please.
Is this thing on? Welcome everybody to Asks in Praxis. Today's going to be pretty dev-centric. We're going to be talking about the value of APIs and kind of what they are, why they matter, and how we use them. So most of us have a developer background, so we'll definitely be talking from a developer point of view, but there's some end user facing and some admin components to this too. So during the course of the session, as usual, please contribute in the chat. Feel free to break in and ask us questions as well, and we'll monitor there too. So here's our agenda for the day, right? What are they? Why should I care? Let's talk about some differences between first party and supported APIs. Get the perspective of the different roles, and then where we have some prescriptive guidance for you about working with APIs, how to get to APIs, how to find out if there's an API for something, etc. We'll provide some resources at the end. So let's rip right in.
Cool. All right. So I'll do this one. What are APIs and why should I care? So an API as defined is an application programming interface. So that means that it lets two different pieces of code talk to each other. So code can talk to code through an application programming interface. An API specification is the contract for those programming interfaces. So when you have a specification, it says you can make a request of a particular API or URL in the case of a RESTful interface, and you know what properties or what pieces of information you need to provide to that endpoint to get the data back that you want to get back, and the data you get back is formatted in a particular way that is outlined by that specification. So from this perspective, we have sort of these two ideas of APIs from the Microsoft 365 platform, and that's the supported APIs on the platform where there is that API specification, where they have published documentation that tells us what that specification is. And then there's the first party APIs. So what's been happening, at least recently, is that we're seeing a lot of new, so let me step back a bit. When Microsoft 365 sort of branched away from the on-premise product of SharePoint and gained a lot of other applications, we started to see a divergence from what, as on-prem developers, we used to have access to with the SharePoint APIs, and there was other application programming interfaces, CSOM being one of those, which was used as a .NET based interface, programming interface. So we had all those interfaces and we had those contracts, and for the most part, everything was available with a contract and supported. What we're starting to see now that we've come online and we have all these other products is that they'd like to move all of those APIs that are supported to what's called the Microsoft Graph. So the Microsoft Graph is a set of APIs that are supported. There is a specification, there is documentation, and a portion of what we had in SharePoint on-prem is available in the Microsoft Graph. However, we still have all of the APIs that were supported by SharePoint available to us, except for the fact that now we're seeing new features come into SharePoint, we're seeing new applications come into the Microsoft 365 ecosystem, and APIs are not being provided that are in that sort of supported place. So new features that come, like modern pages, for instance, as an example in SharePoint, there is no supported API for modern pages in SharePoint Online. And so that's sort of what we're talking about today, is the difference between what we have that's supported and what we have. I mean, we know that there's a programming interface because that's how the internet works. So we know there's a way to do these things, but in order to use them, we would have to sort of hijack the things that the program itself does through the user interface. So that's the conversation that we are having. Anybody have anything they want to add, or I'm going to move on?
Everything she just said goes double for me.
Okay, that's one way to put it. Okay, so I guess we have the slide again. I'm not sure why.
Because these are the perspectives that we bring. So if you click forward, we'll be able to talk about each of the perspectives.
Sorry.
Oh, actually, Emily, sorry, it's right. Everything's kind of incorporated in there. This was just talk track to this slide. So developer point of view, we just caught, but I know the other devs have other comments too, things to add to this.
Okay, well, I'll keep going then. So the perspective here is mostly that we have this situation where that divergence has happened, and now we need to sort of decide how we're going to move forward when we want to be able to build things for accessibility purposes. So if we have this platform and we want to automate anything, or we want to build new line of business applications that take advantage of some of these features, we need to have a way to do that. And without proper documented APIs, that puts us in the position of either saying we can't do it, or we have to reverse engineer and sort of hijack those first party APIs to be able to make those things happen. And when we do that, we have to understand that it's not supported and there is no contract. So even though we can sort of guess at what the contract is, that contract literally can change at any time without any notification to any of us. And if it does, there is no recourse. Your solution will break, and you have to, as the developer or as the consumer of that sort of hacked solution, for lack of a better way to say it, have to deal with fixing it. And so that can be, especially for, critical business applications, that can be a non-starter. But then if it's a non-starter, what is your workaround, right? If there is no workaround, then maybe you're willing to take that risk, or you just won't have that availability in the platform. So the Pages API.
One of those, like if you're doing something temporarily, like Todd and I are trying to deploy something real quick, and we're going to do this one time, and there's no API, we use some wacko trick. That's okay-ish. It's if you want to put something in place that's robust and lasts over time, things may.
Yeah, I can give an example of this. It's kind of outside the platform. I have a Tesla car, and there's an app for it. And Tesla has no published API. They don't want schmucks like me doing anything with it. But some guys that are much smarter than me did a man-in-the-middle of an attack and watched the traffic between the app on their phone and the web, and reverse engineered the API, like Julie said. So they would go into the app, they would turn the heater on, they would look at the web traffic, they would figure out the API for turning the heater on, things like that. And so they published all that. But to Julie's point, after they publish it, Tesla has no expectation that they're going to keep that the way that it is, because it's not published. So those things break every now and then. So I've written PowerShell scripts to turn my car's heater on and things like that. And once in a while they break. And it's because Tesla in the back has changed their API, but they've not published it. There is no contract with us. So you just got to play along.
Right. So I think, where this becomes especially difficult is, there's sort of another layer to this too. So sometimes there's APIs for things, and there's sort of two ways to go about accessing programming interfaces, especially the RESTful kind. Essentially, you have to get a security, you have to go through a security boundary to use any of these programming interfaces. And there's sort of two ways to go about that. You can go about it by going in as yourself, as a user, as a person, or you can go at them as an application. And so sometimes, like if you're using a web interface, going at an API using your personal credentials makes a ton of sense, because you want that API to limit what is able for the person to do based on who they are, right? So especially like if you're building a SharePoint framework extension on the platform, and you want them to access a bunch of documents, you want to make sure that when they make the request for documents, that they only get documents that they actually have access to. You wouldn't want to bypass the security that's inherently in the platform. So that's the idea behind user credentials. The idea behind application credentials is if you're building automation code in general, this is the use case here, or if you're trying to elevate permissions. So the idea is that if you have an application that's doing something, so you have a set of work where let's say it's a timer job thing, something that you want to have happen once a day, and you want that application to do a set of tasks as the application. You don't really want it tied to any specific user credentials, because that user might not always be around, but also because you want it to just have a set of credentials or a set of permissions based on what you grant it, and that we call an application registration. And so those are the two different ways that you can go about accessing these code interfaces. And the sort of issue that can arise too, that I've sort of seen in the environment, is that some of the APIs allow you to access them via user, and some of them allow you to access it as an application, some both. But the problem comes around when you want to access it as an application because you want to automate something, but that API endpoint has only been implemented to allow a user to use it, for instance. And so then you have to jump through a lot of hoops to sort of make that situation happen. And so that's pretty tricky.
So I think, Julie, to put a point on that and how it relates to M365, you're specifically talking about Planner. Or as
in
one
this
of the
case,
examples.
But there's more
Right.
than just Planner. But
Yeah.
yeah, that's
So
one of
for
the
instance,
most painful.
If we wanted to create an automation scenario where every time a team got created, we added a Planner board to it, right now we have to hack that together because there's no API, there's no application level API for Planner. You have to create a user, add that user to the team, create the Planner as that team, and then potentially remove that user. So we end up taking on this inherent level of technical debt to help hack these things together. And, it's, as Mark said, if it's one thing if you're doing a one-off and you just got to make it work to get it through, but it's a totally different story if you're building, say, a provisioning engine, or you're building something that's meant to be enterprise level.
Right. And so I think the consequences of these gaps that we're starting to see in the platform is that we're losing adoption traction, right? Because I think, yes, a lot of people use the platform out of the box through the UI, and that's wonderful. But I think a significant portion, and this sort of speaks to the maturity model idea, that as organizations get more mature in their use of the platform, they start wanting to tie the pieces of the platform together to use them sort of as a service, where they can build line of business applications that utilize various aspects of the platform. And without these programming interfaces available, and without them all having the same security context, i.e. both the ability to use them both as users and as applications, without all of that done, we start to lose traction in the platform and our ability to sort of mature on the platform. And I think that can lead to sort of platform abandonment. You're going to end up, if you can't get something done in the platform, you're going to end up going to look for a different tool that will allow you to build that, or will do that for you, right? And so I think, unfortunately, it's a huge miss from the platform to not prioritize making sure that we have API endpoints available to do all of this work that we want to do.
Yeah, and this seems like a dev topic, but one of the big trends that us admin folks have been struggling with as the march to the cloud has been happening is, what do our jobs look like? Like, there's just not room for guys like me to swap out hard drives and power supplies anymore. Like that's not a thing. And so DevOps has been the answer to all of those things. And, this idea that guys like me sling PowerShell all the time and find creative solutions to stuff. And without those APIs, we can't do that. It's even an IT thing. And I can't remember if so that point there, just because you can do it in the UI doesn't mean you can automate it. That's generally the position that I start with. If I can do something, I assume I can automate it. And that is a false assumption, but that's the position I start at.
Well, and it's becoming more and more of a false assumption, I think, is the problem.
Right. Yeah.
And that's where we get into trouble, not just us at Praxis working with our clients, but anyone who's out there with a sort of development mindset, and somebody says, oh, I did this thing. Can you make that happen 1,200 times? And you're like, sure, no big deal.
Yeah. How tough could it be?
Yeah. And then
Iris,
it takes a lot of work to figure out that, oh, gee, their API isn't there, or the API doesn't do what the UI does. It does something a little bit less or a little bit different.
Yeah. Iris, you have a question?
Yeah, I'm just wondering, since you mostly are using the API to develop things for the customers and it has a certain purpose, how do you deal with like explaining to people that it may stop working and someone may change something and you have no way of knowing when or if? Is there really no standard that the APIs must adhere to?
That is the case for some of them. And so let me just reiterate to say that we have all of the SharePoint APIs that we had when it was an on-prem solution, and they exist, they are documented, and they are robust. We have a bunch more that came with the Microsoft Graph. They are documented, they are fairly robust, and you can gain support for those. Where we're talking about really is there's somewhat of a gap now, and that gap is getting wider and wider, and it's getting more and more concerning to those of us who do regularly perform automation on the platform. So it started with the Pages API, not having that, and it sort of has just been growing and growing. We have the new products like Syntax. We have the new products, the Viva products. We have Connections is a different conversation, but we have Viva Topics and we have Learning. Those two don't have any kind of API available for them. And so we're sort of seeing this modernization of the platform and adding functionality to the platform, but they're not releasing APIs that are public at the same time. And I think we've been giving this feedback, and so I think they know it, but it's good for the rest of the world to understand it too, so that they can make sure that when they do decide they want to automate something, they know what they're getting into. And so to answer your question, when we get a request to build something for a customer and it's going to require using pieces of technology that aren't supported like that, we have to definitely disclose that right up front and make sure that the client is willing to deal with that level of risk.
Yeah, and so Iris, I think that's to build on what Julie said. You can't know if an API is going to work through the end of time. If you use the ones that Microsoft publishes, for the most part, they have this process where they deprecate them so that you know months or years in advance whether it's going to keep working. And like the graph is going through that. There's, the 1.0 and 2.0 endpoints for the graph, things like that. So you can't know, but if you use the main ones, they give you heads ups usually, not always.
Well, at least they're supported. I think that's the real take-home message. Like, you can call support and they will support you on those endpoints, although I almost laugh at support, but we won't go there.
That was a few weeks ago.
Yeah.
I'm over the trauma.
Support?
Mostly.
They have support?
Mm. So anyway. All right. Anybody else with any other comments?
So I also want to point out, so it goes beyond just SPFX, right? Because you can use these endpoints in the Power Platform. You can use them in Flow. You can use them in Logic Apps. You can use them everywhere. And so, not having them not only limits your ability to write custom functionality using SPFX, but it also goes out there and it limits your ability of what you can do via those other low or no code platforms, which in turn makes those way more complicated than there needs to be, right?
Yeah,
so there's no way to copy a flow to multiple places. So instead, you've got to get it, hack it apart, and push it back out there. So it's not just an SPFX or a JavaScript thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think we see when you do a search on how to do something in Power Automate, for example, you'll find somebody who says, put your left elbow into your right ear and then just use these 12 different connectors and send this thing over here and go over there. Probably the reason that that's so complicated, or sometimes it's just people come up with odd stuff, is there isn't a connector that does that one thing, because there's no API to do that one thing, which means you end up gluing together a whole bunch of other stuff. So you're right, Derek. It's not just developers who suffer through this. If you wanted to do certain things with Planner through Power, Julie's example, you can't do those things because there isn't an API that allows you to do that in the way that you want to do it.
Yeah, I think. Go ahead.
I was going to say, to build on Derek's point, a thing that I had a while back is I had written an Azure function for a customer that did a bunch of things, and I wrote it in PowerShell because I have that hammer, so everything looks like a nail. And one of the things that they wanted to do after we had started writing this is they wanted to be able to rename site collections, sites in SharePoint Online. And that's a thing. It's in the UI. I can do it. So I tell the customer, sure, how tough can it be? And I was using the PNP PowerShell, shout out to those folks. And so I started looking, and there was no commandlet for that. There was just no rename site or anything like that. And so what I ended up doing was poking around. And so then I'm like, well, is it because there's no way to do it outside of the UI, or is there a way, but the PNP just hasn't figured it out? So another great project is the M365 CLI project in the PNP. And so I looked, and they did have a command that renamed sites. So I cracked the code open because it's open source, and there was an API in there. And so I basically just translated that API from the CLI into PowerShell. And the PNP has an invoke REST request commandlet. So I was able to take that thing and build the PowerShell bit that the customer needed and get the job done. And I was only able to do that because there was an API out there for it. And had there not been, so kind of tangentially for that, we have found through some customer dealings that when you rename a site collection or site and that redirect site gets created, if you delete that redirect site, there's no way to recreate it. There's no API for that. And so that's just a dead end. But then, so that's an example where having the API helped somebody else because I was able to transform it like Derek talked about, and a story where not having an API kind of sucked.
I think there's another sort of non-technical user aspect of this that we sort of haven't talked about, which is that you'll have site owners or business users who aren't technical in any way, shape, or form, wanting functionality that they can see in the UI and sort of making plans. And unless they have access to someone technical enough to check these things out, they're going to potentially just assume that things can be done that can't be done because of that whole, it's done in the UI, but there is no supported way to do it technically. And I think that can be sort of a rabbit hole that non-technical people can fall into.
As the least technical person at Sympraxis, in all probability, if you're not me, who's like, I'm surrounded by MVPs with an immense amount of insight about APIs, where they're headed, where they stand, et cetera. But if you're out there in industry and you don't have a team like ours to do it, I mean, other than the obvious, we'll hire us to do it. Other than that, is there guidance we give to people to say, is there a way to know that there's an API for this? How would I research that? Do some of my own legwork. Some of this might be in resources,
really, but it's really difficult. What I want to say is the better answer is sort of to not overspend in your plans before you get those plans vetted. And so put together the best possible description of what you'd like to attain, and then get that vetted by someone technical who can translate what you're looking for into the set of requests that would need to happen, what technology would need to be used, and thereby, that's not a big spend to just get validation before you go down this huge long road and then get to that point of development where you've already spent thousands to hundreds, tens of thousands of dollars planning your project and thinking you're going to solve something this way, only to find out then that you're not going to be able to solve it that way. So early failing, I guess, early
Sure.
validation.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, I think it's also important as a business person, as someone doing requirements gathering or even writing their own requirements, to ask the dev team, ask your technical resources, is there an API for this, right? Is this supported? Is this something, because if you don't ask, you may not necessarily know that someone is hacking apart something and using an unsupported API. So, if something sounds tricky or something like that, just ask the question. And that way you'll know when your dev goes, oh yeah, sure, or well, kind of, sort of, you can help make those decisions. And then maybe you can veer your requirements.
Let me ask the question a different way. If I'm a dev and I'm getting newly acquainted to this world, to this ecosystem, what are some of the places I'd go to learn more about whether an API exists, what the endpoints are, et cetera?
I mean, I think the Graph Explorer is probably the first place I would go from a graph perspective. It's really great and it's really easy to make sample calls right in the browser. There's also a huge, for a dev audience, there's also a collection of Postman collections, so that you can actually make a lot of the calls just in Postman to test things out. That's the first.
Are these
place
on the
I would
resources slide? Let's toggle forward because we're close to the end of time anyway.
They should be.
Yeah, if not, let's add them before
the Postman wasn't, but the graph documentation is, and there's a link to it from there. So if you go to that,
I'm going to add the Graph Explorer on there separately though.
Yeah, so but it is a link at the top of that graph documentation.
Yeah.
But that's a good one. If you're specifically trying to hit SharePoint APIs, then the SharePoint REST endpoints are good. Documentation, I mean, I'll give a shout out to my own solution, but the PMP.js SDK that I help run has documentation for we support every SharePoint API that is available. It's implemented in the PMP.js. So even if you're not going to use JavaScript, TypeScript to do it, you would be able to see if it's possible to be done. So you could use the documentation as a reference.
And I do that all the time. So Microsoft's documentation team, at least the Office 365 one, doesn't get enough credit. They've got some great documentation out there. And there's been a ton of times when I've wanted to do something in PowerShell that I couldn't figure out how to do. And so to answer the question, is there an API for this? I will go look, for C# or JavaScript or something, just to see, look at the class of the object. And, so like the site renaming thing. The way I was able to figure out that could be done was I went and looked the class up and looked at the operations and all that, and it was there. And I'm like, okay, so there's something to grab onto. I just need an example of how to grab onto it. And that's when I found it in 365 CLI.
And I think between the graph and the SharePoint REST endpoints, even someone who's not necessarily technical could look at those and say, oh, okay, there is an API for that, or help, broker better informed conversations with your development team.
Yeah, Derek, I've actually used Graph Explorer to be like, oh yeah, that is in the payload. That thing I was looking for is what gets returned if I do this. Even a monkey like me can do that. So that's
you don't have to be super technical to use that test, because it's just they give you dummy data. You don't have to. You can log in and authorize a certification so it can use the data in your tenant, but it's all full of sample data. So that's super helpful without having to actually jump through the hoops of getting it authorized in your tenant.
Yeah.
So I know we're close on time. Thank you, Rob Windsor, for being the Greek chorus who's consistently adding color to what we're saying in the chat. In 2 weeks' time, we've been accumulating some requests from folks in our mailbag. I'd like to invite all of you on the call today and anybody who listens to this in a recording to submit Asks and Praxis Anything topics. So we've got about a half dozen in the queue right now, which we can prioritize, but we'd love to hear from you. What's important to you and what you'd like to learn more about. Anything else to add, folks, to close it out, other than the places where you can see us live? If folks are going to Las Vegas, we look forward to seeing you in person. If you're there, thank you, Krista, for submitting a new question. That's awesome. And Joy, thank you for the shirt.
Yep, I'll be in Vegas. Actually, I think Mike and Emily
Yes.
Yes.
The three of us will be in Vegas, so look for us. I'm presenting a couple of different sessions on Friday. So
Oh,
or
Rob's
Thursday.
going too.
Thursday. Yay!
And Caleb.
All right.
Rob, I know you'll be there. We'll just have to pry you away from a blackjack table or something over the course of the week at some point. It'll be good.
Troublemakers.
Totally are. Traps. All right. Oh, Chris is going to Vegas. God, it's going to be
Great.
a party.
Awesome.
All
Should
right.
do a live remote.
No,
No.
the Wi-Fi is not that good. No.
Fair enough. All right, cool.
All right.
Anything else?
I don't think so.
Back to it. Julie, thanks for bringing this topic to the fore. We know we've gotten a lot of questions about it.
Alrighty. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
Yeah.